This week's episode of the Rural Woman Podcast is brought to you by the patrons of the Rural Woman Podcast. This amazing group of individuals contribute financially to the Rural Woman Podcast to ensure the stories of women in agriculture hit your earbuds each and every week. Want to join them in supporting the stories of women in agriculture while getting access to extended episodes, patron-only episodes, and other great perks? Head on over to wildrosefarmer.com to learn more about how you can become a patron through Patreon. Hi, I'm Katelyn Dubin, and this is the Rural Woman Podcast. I'm a first-generation farmer who married into agriculture. Born and raised in a city, I was so unfamiliar with where my food came from, but I was determined to figure it out. Through my journey into agriculture, I saw women who were strong but humble, often taking a back seat. To me, these women were leaders who deserved a seat at the table. I created the Rural Woman Podcast to share the voices of women in an industry whose stories often went untold. The rural entrepreneurs who live and breathe their work, full of grit and pride. We come here to share our stories, to be in community with each other, to be challenged and inspired, but most importantly, to be celebrated and to be heard. We may not all live, farm, ranch, or homestead the same, but we are all connected. We are rural women, and our stories are worthy of being told. Hey friends, we are celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Rural Women Podcast this year, and we are taking a look back through the inspiring stories that have been shared with us throughout the years. Looking back through these interviews, there are women who have been successful, who have persevered, and who have been resilient. There are women who have shared their stories who may not farm or ranch or homestead or work in the business that they used to. Things may be different for them now, but I know their stories have impact. And I hope that this is a solid reminder for those of you who have shared your stories or who are inspired to share your stories. Our stories are forever changing. And just because we may not farm, ranch, or homestead the same, our lives might not look the same. There has been growth here. Through the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think it's a solid reminder for all of us to look back to see how far we've come. So my friends, I hope you enjoy these throwback podcast episodes coming your way, and thank you for being here and for helping me celebrate the incredible stories of women in agriculture through the Rural Woman Podcast over the last 5 years. Enjoy. Today, you'll meet Sherri Pauls.
Yes, I'm Sherri. On Instagram, I am the Ginger Mom or the G Mom. And I have been I grew up in a farming town in southern Manitoba, but I never was a part of agriculture until 20 years ago when I fell in love and got married and was thrust into the world that is generational farming. I am an incredibly passionate person. I'm a natural ginger, so all the red flags are there. and I'm incredibly stubborn and determined. I am fully saved by grace, and I'm not a huge fan of religion, but I'm a big fan of Jesus. So if I could think about something that would sum me up, I would say that I will say exactly what's on my mind, but I will love you so fiercely no matter what, because I have been loved no matter what. So now my passion is talking mostly to the agriculture community as a motivational speaker, but slowly but surely my passions are growing into more like women's mental health, and especially, like I said, the in-law factor, which is something that I'm very passionate about.
Right. And we're going to dive all into that today. So, being an in-law at the age of 19 and coming on to a multi-generational farm is obviously challenging in so many ways. Can you share your experience and the ways that you have grown over the last 20 years when it comes to being that in-law on the farm?
This I could write a book on, and I would hope that book would never be done, just with how I am still still learning and still making the same mistakes, but also making successes. I was my in-laws' probably worst nightmare. I was not traditional, like a traditional, like in a patriarchal sense. I was not. I met my husband in the mechanic shop I was working in. I was working on his car, and it was like Hallmark movie romance. Like it was very like not your average small town. It was a country song, I always joke. But when I got married and had that first year, and granted, we also were pregnant and having a baby, I almost ran. I almost ran for the hills. I spoke my mind and was met with brick walls. And I tried to know everything and tried to be confident. And I was extremely humbled very quickly. And I'm lucky enough to be in a farming family where they have family meetings and they communicate as good. Like when I think about all the stories I've heard myself and the journeys that I've been on from other farming families, I am incredibly privileged with the farming family that I married into. The males in this family are incredibly secure and very open to hearing what we have to say with respect. I did not, those first years, I did not have respect when I was talking about things that we were doing, trying to learn. I just wanted to be in, like, just get me in there, just put me in a piece of machinery. And they're like, well, whoa, you need to first, there's a journey here. And that wasn't the role that they needed from me. They said, like, we have lots of people to drive machinery. We need you in the dreaded word for me, kitchen. And I bucked at that as hard. And because I've never been a natural talent in the kitchen, I have come to realize that love is not a feeling. Love is a choice. And if I love my family and I can do this beautiful thing for them, then that is a success in itself.
Today, you'll meet Katie Steere.
So I'm Katie Steere, and I am currently and hopefully forever in central Vermont raising grass-fed beef and lamb with my husband. I'm from Rhode Island and lived sort of in Ireland and then California, then back in Rhode Island, and then we found our dream farm here. And yeah, we bought the farm 2 years ago, and we bought it 0% down with a USDA loan, and we've just been on this adventure of like, okay, how do we make this work? So we have 2 Airbnbs on the farm. We live in our Airstream and we rent out our house, and we're sort of just always coming up with new ideas on how to be small farmers and make a living in this day and age.
That's amazing. So tell us more about your farm now and what you and Ben have built and what you've grown in the last 2 years.
Yeah, sure. So we decided when we moved here that we would just do grass-fed animals because we had 100 acres of pasture here, which seemed like a lot then. It doesn't seem like enough now. So we stopped raising pigs and chickens and we got sheep. And I think it was like 2 days before our closing, our bank called us and they said, oh, so it's we have a joint mortgage. So like the FSA gave us half and then the bank gave us half. The FSA guarantees the bank's mortgage. The bank called us and said, oh, we forgot about these 2 fees, which were $12,000 more. And so our closing costs were almost $30,000. And we realized in that moment, okay, we need a plan to make more money very quickly. So we're really lucky that the house is pretty nice. So we ended up moving into the Airstream shell that Ben was renovating and Airbnb-ing our house. And we have a yurt that we Airbnb to. So that's sort of been, I call it our off-farm job. That's sort of been the thing that has like floated us through the first 2 years as we've built fences on the whole farm and just water lines and all of our infrastructure and gotten like, yeah, we had to move the farm across New England, which was quite the feat. And we had to sort of like take a dip in our production during those first 2 years. And so we're going back up. And yeah, this year we're going to be doing a couple of women's retreats, women in wool retreats. And then I also just started making wool dish sponges, which have been really fun and cool. So we're always scheming on how to make money here.
Today, you'll meet Amy Hill.
My name's Amy, and I own Snowy River Farms, which is located in Cooksbrook, Nova Scotia, which is pretty smack dab in the center of Nova Scotia, honestly. And I actually got my start in agriculture in 2003. I went to the agricultural college in Truro, and I'm actually a city girl. I grew up in the suburbs in Dartmouth, and I had a real interest in agriculture, in growing food, in animals specifically. I went for my animal science degree. I sort of intended on doing wildlife rehabilitation likely for my whole life and having a small farm on the side. And I did do wildlife rehabilitation for 6.5 years, but I think I caught the bug quite strongly when I was at college. And I just had more and more of a drive to really just be growing food. So in 2010, I quit my job and started farming full time and just jumped whole hog, I guess you could say, into it. I certainly jumped too hard into it originally and thought I was just going to do everything. And in the last few years, I've sort of stepped back a little bit from the things that took too much time and didn't give enough payback, whether that was financially or even just for my heart, what wasn't speaking to me as much. But now I'm in Cooksbrook and I run a farm on just under 10 acres. But I do an organically minded market garden with some greenhouses. And then we also raise poultry as broilers and as lay hens. And we also do hogs out on pasture. And then I've also got a dairy cow that she's just for the family.
So Amy, how, in terms of marketing your product and the growth of that, what have you been doing that's been successful to market your products to your community?
Yeah, I remember when we first started and we printed off a whole bunch of flyers and I walked around places in Halifax and put up all these flyers. And now when I think about it, I think it's so silly because social media is such a huge part of everyone's life that a lot of our marketing has just moved to social media. I can post on Instagram or Facebook, about our egg shares or our chicken shares or things like that. And they tend to just get sold very quickly because it's just word of mouth, but on Instagram, which travels much faster than, the old way that we had word of mouth. Yeah. So the vast majority of how I'm essentially getting my product out is through either Facebook or Instagram. And then we do have a few other stores and someone who goes to market. That's another farmer who goes to market, but he also brings our product with him. And so we've also got them marketing our product essentially as well. And then we can, get out to everybody.
Today, you'll meet Arlie Laroche.
Yeah, so I grew up on a small farm, like you mentioned, near Yorkton, so near the Manitoba border. And it was a mixed farm. It was a beef and grain farm. So that certainly set me up with a strong connection to nature and a passion for food and a love of animals and all that good stuff. But after I graduated high school, after traveling for a while, I went to college and I studied water resources engineering technology at SciAst. And so I pursued a career in environmental consulting for a while. So I did that for almost 10 years and I really enjoyed it. And, kind of the main reason why I decided to go down that path was because I had concerns about the environment and just really wanted to do what I could to help that. So that's what took me down that path. But I found out after I worked in that field for a while that I just didn't feel like I was getting the full, experience of making a difference. I just didn't feel like I was doing what I set out to do. And at that same time, around 2007, is when my husband and I moved out to a small farm just outside of Saskatoon. And we started kind of a hobby farm there, but we started doing some homesteading, growing a garden and growing a couple of animals just for our own consumption. And it was kind of around that time also when I discovered people like Alan Savory, who just show how regenerative agriculture can be beneficial to the environment. And so I just felt like what I could do at the farm for the environment was probably more powerful and impactful than the work that I was doing in the environmental consulting world. And so that's kind of what pushed me to come back to my farming roots and do that instead.
So you've actually taken your, offerings off of the farm, even further off of the farm, and you opened your own restaurant. So tell us about your restaurant and that experience and how it's going today.
Sure, yeah. So I guess the restaurant kind of was born out of those farm dinners as well. I mentioned that I started doing them with a chef from Aden. And then at the time, I was also working with the Hollows, which also sadly does no longer exist in Saskatoon, but it was another fantastic restaurant. And the head chef there was Scott Dix. And he took over doing the farm dinner for me in about, 2018. And the night that we did the farm dinner with him, it just went so well and everybody was so happy. And Scott and I and Brett is my husband, we all just got on really well. And then my husband and I had thought it could be interesting to do our own restaurant. And meeting Scott, working with Scott a little bit, we just thought if we were ever going to do one, this would be a great guy to do it with. So just started kind of having those conversations with Scott as he understood the restaurant industry far more than my husband and I did. And that's kind of how the idea was born.
Today, you'll meet Bridgette Readel.
So I am a lifelong farm kid extraordinaire. We grew up with dairy and grain, as well as beef animals. And I've learned that that's because my parents obviously were bad at making decisions, so they thought they'd just do everything. And when you do that growing up, you just learn to balance a lot of things all at one time. And I think that prepares us really well for adulthood. It gives us that foundation of how to be parents and full-time employees, and then do fun things like podcasts, etc. And we just get the opportunity to do a variety of things, just like farming might have looked like back at the time frame I was growing up in the 80s and into the 90s. I grew up in North Dakota. My brothers still operate our family farm. My version of farming was being ag chem rep for one of the large companies in the US. And then about 2 years ago, I decided to retire. I had had 25 years in, and my husband and I decided it was time to do something different. Kids were grown and out of the house. They're pretty much off the payroll now, which also, everyone, I hope you strive for that. This empty nesting, kids off the payroll thing, it's fabulous. And we decided that I could pursue some other dynamics in ag. So I now host an ag radio show. I spend plenty of time doing things on social media and promotion for various companies and or just getting out in front of pretty much anything that has to do with rural mental health. And then additionally, I have the opportunity to get out in front of groups to speak. I'm actually headed to one of those events tonight. And sometimes those topics are anything from myth busting in ag to rural mental health to just simply sharing that story of others. And that's the most fun.
You've had your whole life in agriculture and your professional career in agriculture. Can you share some insight into the role of women in agriculture and how that has changed during your professional career?
Well, just the number of us, the sheer number has increased, and that's been outstanding. I think the role of women has also changed in the fact that we bring that teaching skill with us, whether you understand that you do or not. When you're working with a group of farmers, you often are able to teach versus tell. And it's probably, that masculinity thing. Men don't want to be told what to do, but they'll listen to you as a female because you seem more like one of their teachers, right? Makes it a little bit easier. I could go on field calls to diagnose fields where I thought there was a problem. And oftentimes the receptivity of the farmer, the farm family was way better with me than it was with one of my male counterparts, just based on that delivery. That made a difference. But I also think more women coming into the industry, we made it more of a family. When I first started, it was trade shows And we were always going out for beer afterwards. And there were all these late night events. And because it was a little bit of an old boys club. Now, people, instead of doing that, they are bringing their families with for baseball games or for a supper meeting, something where they're involving everyone. And women, they aren't just the wife of a farmer. They are actively involved in making those decisions. What seed do we buy? Where do we get our equipment? They want to be treated as an equal on the farm. And I think that's incredibly important for all of us to remember.
You can help support the stories of women in agriculture to be shared through the Rural Woman podcast on Patreon. What is Patreon? It's a membership-based platform that helps fund and support creators like me to create and produce content like this that you all love. New to the Rural Woman podcast Patreon is ad-free listening and patron-only bonus content and exclusive episodes. Learn more and join the patron gang today at patreon.com/The Rural Woman Podcast. Today, you'll meet Paige Stewart.
Hi, everyone. My name's Paige Stewart. I grain farm with my husband in Fillmore, Saskatchewan. I'm a native to Manitoba, so I'm an import. I never thought I was going to be in agriculture. I loved sports, and my family was all in the public service. My mom was an RCMP officer. My dad was a customs officer. My brother's a corrections officer. So I always thought I was going to end up in that realm of work. But I had grown up on a small hobby farm, which is where some of my happiest memories are, cleaning out the barn with my family on a Saturday morning for the horses and the cows and chickens and all of that fun stuff, or running the rake for my dad at, very young age. We moved off the farm and eventually kind of ended up in Winnipeg. And I took conflict resolution at university, which everyone goes, what is conflict resolution? And why did you take that? Because I thought I wanted to maybe go into law enforcement. My mom said, don't take criminal justice. You're going to learn that when you get into depot or whatever area you go to or get accepted to, hopefully. Take something that makes you stand out. And so that was conflict resolution for me, which turns out conflict resolution is just life skills that have been maybe just warming up for the life that I was supposed to live. Once I finished school, I just took a job. I just took the first thing I could get into, and that was at an ag inputs dealer at a very floor level. I shoveled fertilizer. I didn't know what glyphosate was. Fortunately, the farmers around me gave me the opportunity to learn and stumble and work my way up. And eventually I kind of fell in love with it once I sort of knew what I was doing, and got promoted to sales rep, and then eventually got offered a job as an account manager in southern Saskatchewan, which was going to take me away from my home. What I was excited about, I was single, no attachments, and just wanted to go with the flow. So when I got to Weyburn, didn't know anybody. I wasn't part of the agriculture community, but the opportunity to be an account manager means you get to meet people. That's what you do. You jump in your truck and you meet people. And so that's what I did. My manager at the time said, don't fall in love with a farmer and get married. It's exactly what I did. But I don't take direction well. So there we have it.
What's some advice that you could give specifically for women in the type of role that you had for that, I guess, gumption to be able to say yes to these opportunities instead of shying away from them?
I think first I'd have to point to my mom. She was one of the first women through the RCMP. So she kind of carved that way for me to say, you got to go, you just got to go get what you want. You can't wait to be asked. So if you see it, you take it, and don't be humble about that. I think the people who know me best would say I come off very sure of myself, which I think is hilarious, but it's just that I take risks. It's just that I just do it. So I don't know what to say to other women that maybe haven't had that same push, right? That same support. I think it's just, we have to advocate for ourselves, and we have to have the self-talk to know that we are more than we even know.
Today, you'll meet Jessica Garza.
So I was born and raised on the ranch that we call Moose Valley Ranch. My parents bought it in 1980, and I was born in 1989, and they were there full time. So I don't remember any time where there wasn't, growing up learning to feed, right? They would turn the truck down to the lowest gear and then put me on the seat with the steering wheel and my brother on the floor pushing the gas pedals in low one. And then my mom would be like pushing hay off the back. And so that's where I really started. And it continued through high school. I was involved in everything under the sun, 4-H, FFA, your livestock show, interstate fair boards, public speaking. It was just anything and everything I could do to be involved. So from there, now I'm a wife. I'm a mom of 2 amazing little boys who are just, we call them terrors because they're amazing, but they're so much and so busy. And I work full time off the ranch. My husband does as well. So this is actually technically kind of our side business, but we treat it as a full-time business. I'm just not sure where I squeeze all the hours out of, truthfully. I look back and it's just like, we get a lot done. Like we do a lot. So the ranch is where we call home now. I left for a while. I became a police officer in Montana and was off on my grand adventure, college, all of those things. I sort of left the agricultural realm and thought I was going to be an attorney. And then it turned into a cop. And then it was, I'm moving out of state. I'm never coming home. Plot twist, I came home, right? Isn't it so funny how we make plans?
Exactly. We make plans and then isn't the saying, then God laughs at us at our plans. So,
oh yeah. I never intended on returning to the ranch when I left for that like adulthood experience, but we had babies and my husband's family is from back over here and I was from over here and it just made sense to come home. So we did.
Absolutely. So take us back to when you decided to come back on the ranch and what you've decided to do with it.
Yeah, so we moved home to just have a better family life and work life and still weren't intending on physically being at the ranch. So we moved to a house just like 10 minutes away. And it wasn't until we started realizing sort of in that succession planning that eventually likely half of the ranch at least was going to come to us. And it's a lot. It's a lot of property. It's a lot of property taxes. And we strongly were like, we're not working our butts off to pay off our home and then retire and end up having a land payment that's more than what our mortgage was, right? Because we had very traditional jobs, retirement after 20, 25. And so your goal, right, when you're in those sorts of careers is like to pay the house off before you retire, because then you have that whole, but we're looking down the barrel at something that was going to be by that point even more than our mortgage. And we looked at each other and said, if this is going to work, it has to pay for itself. And not knowing any of the current financials, my brother was still farming the property. He still does do the traditional agriculture. And it was this conversation of there's not any more ground for me to farm. There's no room for me in the farming. There's no room for me. He has a small herd of cattle, nothing like what my parents used to run, but just enough to kind of keep him going. And it was like, well, what else can I do? And quite frankly, I don't want to sit in a tractor and go in circles all day. I'm a very high functioning, high speed kind of person. And I would probably crawl out of the cab walls, just deck mowing. Sometimes I'm like, get me out of the tractor. So we just started brainstorming, and I had a friend who really encouraged me to look at the aesthetic value of the property, because people come out here and they tell you, oh my God, this is amazing, because we sort of get used to it, right? It's just what it is. And then you'll have a friend come out for the first time and they're like gobsmacked. Holy cow, this is so cool. This is incredible. And so I just started exploring that. And I had a friend who asked if her daughter essentially could get married at the ranch. And I thought, well, here we go. And it took off from there.
Today, you'll meet Victoria Lee.
So I guess it started when I was a kid. I think my inspiration probably came from my grandfather. When we grew up in the suburbs, we just had a typical 50-foot lot, a house, and my grandfather tore out all the grass and actually turned the backyard into an urban farm. And back then it wasn't done at all. So in fact, we would probably get made fun of by the kids that would come through and see the giant vegetable garden. And with my background, I'm a Chinese Canadian. So we would preserve our food by drying it out in the sun. So a lot of our fresh produce was sun-dried. So we'd have vegetables hanging on the laundry line and things like that. And we'd be running through the yards and the kids would be like, what is that? So I guess that's where I kind of got my start from my grandfather. He kind of inspired it. And I didn't really know how much I loved it until I got older. So I do regret a little bit not listening and watching a little bit more carefully. But since then, I kind of had a interesting work life, and I just didn't really find anything that was fulfilling to me. And my friend of mine owned the Basil Ranch in Calgary, and she had had it for about 16 years. And she wanted to sell and move out to the coast. And so she contacted me and asked me if I was interested in purchasing. And I said yes. Back then, the Basil Ranch was an import distribution company. And when I had purchased it, it was a boom year in Calgary, and it was the last boom year in Calgary. So sales were great, but we had a lot of trouble in the summertime fighting airlines for cargo space because everyone was traveling. And we had boxes and boxes and hundreds of pounds of produce go bad. And I just couldn't handle it. I thought, I have gotten into the wrong business. I cannot handle the waste. Here I was thinking that I was doing something good and trying to provide fresh produce for people here in Calgary, but it didn't work out so well. We mostly supplied to restaurant and grocery and hotels, and so the demand of the quality is quite high. So my parents would come and try to help us dry as many herbs as we could for our own use, but I mean, that happened a couple of weeks and then we're like, we can't use all this. So I just had to find a different solution. And so that winter, I looked into hydroponic growing. And I thought that, based on our climate here north, that's really our solution here to provide food year round. So that's what we did. We tested a few things in the garage. And once we had the right systems in place, I got a warehouse. And we started growing in a 2,000 square foot warehouse. So that's how the hydroponics started.
That is very, very interesting. What type of flowers are you growing? What's on your roster?
Oh my goodness. So many. The best ones are probably cosmos, bachelor buttons, zinnias, dahlias, snapdragons. Oh, geez. We also grow herb flowers, so basil flowers, oregano, dill, cilantro, all of that, you name it. I'm also looking at possibly doing some growing for dyeing. So we're going to look a little bit whether or not I have space for it. But so, yeah, possibly doing plants for dyeing. And there's some people who are looking at more medicinal things too. So there's some chefs who are looking into that. So I'm looking into some more medicinal, but all of that's a little bit touch and go because it's hard to educate everybody on that. So I don't want anyone getting poisoned. And there's also interesting regulations with that kind of thing that I haven't quite looked into. So that's another rabbit hole that I'll have to go down as we go through the season to see how much time I have.
Today, you'll meet Courtney Witt.
My name's Courtney Witt. I was born and raised in Southern California, and my husband and I started dating around 21, 22, 23, somewhere in there. We grew up in the same city. We lived in what we call tract homes, so every third house is the same model. They're pretty close together. And I was dog sitting for these ladies, and they had backyard chickens. And so I told my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, I'm like, hey, you got to come with me to take care of these dogs and chickens. This is so neat. And so we convinced his dad to let us build a chicken coop in his backyard. And we collected all these pallets from local grocery stores, built this chicken coop,
4 suddenly turned into 10, which I'm not sure we were allowed to have that many. And all of the neighbors around it would, watch over the fence, or we'd give them eggs. And the neighbors next door that had backyard chickens themselves, they were actually missionary pilots in Africa. And they said to my husband, "You love this. This is your hobby. Like, you two get off work and this is what you do. You're so good at this. You're a natural." At this point, we had gotten a little like miniature pig in his backyard too. I mean, it was turning into a farm. And he said, "You need to go to school for livestock production and management." And my husband is like, "I don't, like, they offer that around here? Where?" So we went to this local community college up the road, and we're like, let's just go in and just kind of see what it's like. And out walks this guy in cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, and he had an accent, and we're like, who is this guy? So we sat down and talked to him, and Andrew was like, "Look, I'm not really interested in the degree. As soon as Courtney finishes school to become a special ed teacher, we want to move to Texas and start a farm." He said, "I really just want to learn what I need to learn to be able to do that."
I love that story, Courtney. Just the slow journey into it and having it as kind of an interest, and then it turns into a hobby. And then it sounds like it turned into the all-out plan that you were going to make this happen, whether it was in Texas or in Arkansas. I'm always curious to ask, as a fellow city kid who grew up in town, what are some of your first memories around food and food production? I know in California there's so many different crops grown, but what are your first memories around food and where food came from?
I was never a huge vegetable fan as a kid. I remember one time my mom steamed broccoli, and I almost gagged and she thought I was being dramatic. And I was like, "No, I'm serious. I just can't eat this." It was really soggy and watery. And when I was 18, my aunt took me to Ireland to visit family friends, and she grew a little garden in her backyard, and she had made, salad and vegetables on the side, all from her garden, and I loved it all. I thought it was delicious. I couldn't get enough. And that was kind of when I realized there is a difference. Obviously, how you cook it helps too, but I think that kind of sparked something in me young, and I just started to kind of appreciate gardening. I lived at home, and we had an in-ground pool in our backyard and a barbecue, and there really wasn't any room to garden, but I just remember being so fascinated by hers, and I just noticed such a difference in the taste of the food that she grew herself.
Today, you'll meet Kristine Beck.
Now, I'm from Clarendon, Quebec, so I grew up just 10 minutes down the road here, and from the Pontiac County, so we're about an hour from Ottawa, but on the Quebec side in Western Quebec. And I'm a dairy and cash crop farmer in cahoots with my husband. So he's my business partner, life partner, co-parent, of course. And I got my start in farming. I married into agriculture. So he's a 4th generation farmer, but I grew up with self-employed parents in a small town, but I got my start marrying into the industry.
You mentioned that you are in the process and you've started switching over to robotics, which as a non-dairy farmer, I think is absolutely incredible. And recently I was just at a farm show and I was looking at the robotic features that are now available in the forever changing world of technology and agriculture. So take us through what that transition has been like for you guys and what led you to wanting to go down the robotics route.
Well, that's a good question. So we're not there yet. We're still in the construction phase. So the cows are still going through the parlor, and we're kind of have our barn half tore up on one side, and we have one robot room ready. But if I go to the beginning of what led us to that, so as we made the transition, so 2019 is when we moved to the freestall that we're at now. And it was originally built. So my in-laws built that in 2008. They built that while we were out west. And they moved into that barn then. So we moved in 2019, and it's just kind of like anything else. The infrastructure was starting to age, and as you start thinking about scalability and what your goals are and what your growth goals are, and how can we add animal units and still be effective, and how can we increase production, with the footprint that we have in the interim, that would say, well, we'll probably have to think about milking 3 times a day. So then what does staffing look like? And we have a front exit parlor. So there were a lot of different considerations about increasing efficiency and looking at the infrastructure that we currently had. So then we decided, and we knew that the technology that we could get out of it was, dated. So we wanted to be able to have more tracking, more data on the cows, on production. So a little bit more streamlining. So we did a huge list of pros and cons, because we weren't necessarily sold initially on going for sure with robotics. So we wanted to consider, would we replace it with a parlor? Would we go robotics? We weren't really sure. So we did the whole list of pros and cons. And I guess where the tipping point really was for us was that we had to upgrade and change our bulk tank. And so when the supplier came, the owner of the company came, and they also sell Lely robots. And so we talked about whether we would change for a parlor or a robot, and had the conversation with him. And then he explained to us some of the construction work that we would have to do to the front of the barn. And we realized we would have to take down a portion and rebuild the entire parlor front of the barn, which would probably make the project be 50% more cost than it would be to retrofit our barn and to put 3 robots in. And then we started to think of, if we wanted to start milking the cows 3 times a day, that's an increased staffing challenge. So rather than have to go down the path of looking at how we were going to staff it, and also the increased construction costs, we thought, no, I think it's just time. The fit for us and where we wanted to go with the herd led us to choosing to put in the robots.
Thanks for listening to the Rural Woman Podcast. The Rural Woman Podcast is more than just a podcast. We are a community. A huge thank you to the Rural Woman Podcast team, audio editor Max Hofer. A special thanks to our Patreon executive producers, Sarah Reedner from Happiness by the Acre and Carrie Munven from Laystone Farms. To learn how you can become a Patreon executive producer or other ways to financially support the show, head on over to wildrosefarmer.com to learn more. Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen to the podcast to get the latest episodes directly on your playlist. And if you are loving the show, please be sure to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform that accepts ratings and reviews. You can connect with us on social media at The Rural Woman Podcast and with me at Wild Rose Farmer. One of the best ways you can support the show is by sharing it. Send this episode to a friend or share on your social media. Let's strengthen and amplify the voices of women in agriculture together. Until next time, my friend, keep sharing your story. Did you know that you can get this same great episode of the Rural Woman Podcast ad-free? I get it. Listening to ads during a podcast isn't always my favorite either. But in order to keep the lights and coffee pot on here at the Rural Woman Podcast Studios, they are necessary. I am so grateful to each and every one of my sponsors, but if you yourself would like to skip the ads while supporting the show, consider joining me over on Patreon. Patrons of the Rural Woman Podcast get ad-free episodes starting at Tier 5 on their podcast player of choice each week, plus some other great benefits. Find out more by heading to the link in today's show notes to learn how you can become a patron through Patreon.